Today on Public Research.
I don't think they've considered at all that their rhetoric, Netanyahu's rhetoric on Amalek, even Herzog, there are no innocent people there. I mean, Smotrich said that he wanted Gaza to be like the Warsaw Ghetto. These people make it very easy for diaspora Jews who defend Israel to be stigmatized. And they also don't consider at all in their conduct of the war and their choice to drag it on that every day it goes on, French and American Jewish life become harder. They just do.
An American historian of France, Daniel Solomon, joins me to discuss why he left the UAW as an academic worker, weaponization of the Holocaust, questions of genocide, obsessive anti-Zionists, far-right Israelis, and the state of French politics. Just a quick note for the audience, this conversation was recorded on July 28, 2024. Since then, the French conservative Michel Barnier has become the Prime Minister of France. So there was the visit of Benjamin Netanyahu to give a speech in Congress, and there was a protest outside where an individual got up and graffitied the words, "Hamas is coming." There were people waving Hamas flags. There was one sign in particular that said, "Allah is great for gathering all the Zionists together for the final solution." And then depicted a mushroom cloud over the state of Israel. Now, an interesting detail that was overlooked was one of the organizers of that protest was the UAW.
Wow. That's so bad. I didn't even know that.
So why don't we back up and explain, you're an academic. How did you become part of a union with auto workers?
Sure. I mean, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley, in the history department, and I specialize in French and Jewish history. Mostly, I focus on the late 19th century and early 20th century in my research. But, I'm as much as I can be a generalist whose interests span, the whole modern career of French Jewry. In any case, over the years, there has been a movement to unionize what are called academic workers, which is to say graduate students, because in America, part of the graduate student stipend or package is usually dependent on teaching as a teaching assistant. And so there are some people who have argued that, graduate student TAs constitute essentially an academic proletariat. And for reasons that remain sort of unbeknownst to me, the group that took the lead in unionizing this group, the academic workers, was the UAW, United Auto Workers. And, now they must have at least tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dues paying members. I know in California it's like 50,000 who are graduate students. Obviously, it's kind of a surprising turn of events, given that, standing at a blackboard and delivering a lecture on Napoleon really is quite different than, assembling a Ford. But, here are these very discrete movements and collections of laborers in the same union. And also, I should say that probably part of the reason the UAW wanted to do that is that, if you look at the structure of the UAW, 2/3 of its members are retirees. Because of American deindustrialization and the decline of the big three automakers, because the UAW doesn't represent all auto workers. For example, a lot of the plants in the South, that Toyota has, for example, do not have union representation. So I think that in some ways it was a strategy of the UAW to remain relevant and to boost its membership by casting a wider net.
So, according to Google Gemini, there are almost 33,000 auto workers in California as of 2021. So, you're
Yeah,
saying there are more UAW members in California that are academics than auto workers?
definitely.
Wow. Wow.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, technically, our units are supposed to represent like 50,000 people across the UC system. And that's only the UC system. I think that they may be trying to do the same thing in the Cal State system or on private campuses. I suppose it's a canny move from the UAW, to bolster its declining membership rolls.
That that is so, because I had thought of it before as, oh, it's UAW is mostly auto workers, but now they've added a little sprinkling of academics, but I guess that's really not the story, is it?
So I think at the national level, the auto workers still quite outnumber the academics. But yeah, I mean, in states like California, where they're obviously the auto industry is not huge, right? You know, yeah, I'm sure the academic employees outnumber the UAW auto workers.
So your name is Daniel Solomon. I should introduce you first. And you're living in France currently doing your academic work. Why don't we back up and just start with your City Journal piece, which has the interesting title of Why I Quit My Academic Union. And so you're not someone who's inherently hostile to unions, right?
No, I mean, I think that, in fact, as I wrote in the piece, I think that unions, I'm a strong believer in, what we call in social sciences the third sector, basically civil society, which exists between the state and, let's say, the private sphere of the family. I think we need that, both to have a healthy politics and to be sane individuals. Famously, it's like Robert Putnam, right, who's documented the decline of that third sector in Bowling Alone and other studies. Um, and, I think that the union hall and the union organization represented a form of sociability and association for many people in the 20th century. Um, it gave them a place in society. It gave them literally a place to convene. Um, and I think that part of the story of the decline of sociability in the United States, and why people feel so atomized, you know, yes, American religion has receded. The Rotary clubs have shrunk, but also the unions have. And so I think that on on a certain level, I champion unions because I think that they serve an important social and psychological purpose, or have, for millions of workers. Uh, and also, I think it's important for us to encourage people to transcend their own individualism at times and consider their own collective interests. Um, and unions at their best can help us do that. So, yeah, in many ways, I would say that I'm a believer in labor unions.
So what brought you to leaving the UAW?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I joined, right, was out of a pretty conventional concern about uh, pay and conditions, uh, in the sense that, I would hardly call myself part of the proletariat in the sense of my own kind of academic pedigree and, the fact that I have forms of outside income. But if you were to subsist on a teaching assistant salary, it'll be very, close to the bone. It would cut very close to the bone. Um, Before the 2022 strike, which led to a significant rise in wages, the UC system was paying its TAs less than the required minimum wage in San Francisco, slightly less. Um, because it has exceptions as a state institution. I mean, I find that really egregious. Uh, you know, I joined the union because I think that, you know, people have a right to advocate for their interests collectively. They need to. I thought that there was, to some degree, I thought that we were getting a raw deal from the university. And, you know, I also think that, again, it's an important way to insert yourself into social life to a certain degree. Um, so that's why I joined the union. Uh, and the problem is that it really seemed to have turned its back on what its main, you know, mission was in the past year. You know, it's like, not to be too historical here, but you know, there was a debate inside American labor in the 30s and 40s about how political the movement should be. And even though the movement wound up ultimately in our time supporting the Democratic Party, the goal was never, you know, to use American labor to transform society politically. Unlike in Europe, where labor unions came to have a much harder, more radical edge, American labor unions are historically conservative. In that, I mean, they advocate for the interests of their members. And what I saw was that our union was becoming more like a kind of European pressure group. Um, Not so much concerned with our immediate, you know, questions around wages and conditions, but that it saw itself as part of some grand revolutionary moment, and that it felt that it was going to grind to a halt the university in pursuit of, you know, pro-Palestine agenda items. I just think that's wholly inappropriate. There was also language that was being used that I didn't agree with around, you know, accusing Israel of genocide, etc. Um, and finally, you know, I couldn't ignore the fact they were associating themselves with encampments that had generated both anti-Semitic rhetoric and violent outbursts. You know, and I had been in touch with a number of Jewish and Israeli members who were either quitting or in, you know, agonizing dialogue with union leadership. And ultimately, I concluded that this union was totally irreparable.
It seems like the influx of the academic workers has transformed the UAW. Is that the case?
Well, it's hard to say because each region has autonomy. So, like, we're in Region 6, and Region 6 is mostly academic workers in California. And that's a very radical region. Um, you know, and it has 50,000 Jews paying members. So surely it influences the overall UAW. You know, but it's hard to quantify
And they
the
get to vote
influence.
for the leader, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I
Okay.
mean, so yeah. Clearly there's some electoral and financial sway that's coming with the burgeoning of the academic worker contingent. I just don't have the numbers in front of me, so I can't tell you how much, you know,
Let,
in
let me
terms
let
of
me
money.
let me put it this way. If it was still just auto workers, do you think Sean Fain would be giving press conferences with Jamal Bowman and Rashida Tlaib?
I don't, you know, I can't say definitively. I think it's less likely. Um, it's less likely. I mean, he has to placate these people to be elected. So yeah, I think it matters. But also, let's remember that a lot of the people now who are working in the conventional auto industry in Detroit, it's no longer Jack and Jill. It's Ahmed and Fatima. You know, uh, remember that, you know, part of the recomposition of the population of the upper Midwest around a lot of these old auto centers in the 70s and 80s and 90s was from Arabs. Uh, so it wouldn't surprise me too
Uh-huh.
if, you know, if within those ranks there was pressure as well. I mean, remember Dearborn, you know,
Right,
where's
right, right.
Dearborn? Uh, I think it's probably both.
So in I think December, UAW called for a ceasefire. And then 5 days ago, apparently they sent a letter with some other unions demanding an end to all aid, military aid to Israel.
Wow.
Um, what's your assessment of Sean Fain?
I think that, he's become the darling of many on the radical left. I'm pretty sure Jacobin has had like a glowing profile of him. To be honest with you, I think he probably reflects radicalism that's palpable in his own membership on this issue. I think that Fain is on the more aggressive end of organized labor and the more ideological end of organized labor today. When you compare him with some of the quieter people at the AFL-CIO or AFSCME, yeah, I'd say the UAW now is one of the more activist unions under his leadership. And maybe that's not wholly a bad thing in the sense that, listen, I think that he's also engendered a lot of popularity by overseeing successful strikes at the auto plants that wrung significant concessions from the big automakers. But, from where we sit, it's not particularly congenial on Jewish issues.
What's interesting is up until October 7th, it was all economics. It was the kitchen
Yeah.
table issues. It was,
Yeah.
we want better pay and stuff. I was very sympathetic towards. Workers. We need to be able to have a life too. We need leisure
And he'd been doing
time.
a good job. He'd been doing a
Yeah,
good
doing
job,
great. The
in
strategic
advancing
strikes.
that. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. But it is interesting that this is I don't think has he said anything out of they haven't done any press conferences on trans rights, right? I mean, there hasn't
No.
been, and this is the one issue. And
I
if
think it must be demographic. I mean, I'd be
yeah,
really curious.
but is this the
Obviously,
one issue that they have?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
interesting.
They're not out there, defending drag queen story hour, as far as I
Or
know.
the Uyghur genocide, or if China invades Taiwan, I don't think he's going to have a word to say about it. But well, maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'd be curious to see if there were ethnic statistics about the makeup of UAW membership. I don't think I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the unions that's been the most vocal against Israel has been the UAW, and one of the unions that has been the most reticent in terms of condemning Israel is the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers. I mean, the UAW probably has a large Arab American contingent at this point, in addition to the academic workers. And the AFT was a union built and organized by American Jews and still led by one, Randy Weingarten, who's to the left on Israel, but I would say is like probably a J Street leftist.
So how radical do you think Sean Fain is on Israel, or is he a BDS guy at heart?
I mean, listen, I can't assess. All I can tell you is they're letting UAW Region 6 put out statements that refer to Israel as committing a genocide, and call for BDS. So they're allowing their own locals to organize with BDS, even if the national organization is not taking that stand. I think that's fairly, it's astonishing. I wouldn't be surprised if the UAW winds up endorsing BDS in the next 5 years. It's very concerning.
Uh, why don't we just address this? Because I think one of the mistakes people have made is a lot of people who don't think it's a genocide find it so offensive that they don't even argue with it, which I think is a huge strategic mistake. So I'll just ask you, why
Mm.
isn't it a genocide?
So I wrote a long piece in the Tel Aviv Review of Books back in December that tried to address exactly this question. So I'll just distill that piece here. Well, I think that the genocide comparison is made deliberately to evoke the Third Reich and the Holocaust. Of course, there are other genocides, but somehow people never really compare Israel to like the Hutus, or the CCP or the Turks vis-a-vis the Armenians. What they always seem to want to be going for is to create this kind of poetic justice in which the Jews have become Nazis. The circle has been, we've come full circle. And the thing is that, the rhetoric just does not match the reality. Back last year, you had Masha Gessen write a piece in the New Yorker in which she said that pre-October 7th, Gaza was like the Warsaw Ghetto. No, it wasn't. As I wrote in this piece in the Tel Aviv Review of Books, Gaza had something like a population density of 3,000 people per square mile. The Warsaw Ghetto had a density of 40,000 people per square mile. So, the conditions that European Jewry faced, the material deprivation, is much worse than the so-called siege of Gaza. And, people have lamented, right, that Israel supposedly, through its blockade, limits the number of calories that Gazans can consume to the bare minimum, subsistence. Well, I can tell you this: the Nazis were trying to keep Jews on a diet of about 300 calories a day in most of the Eastern European ghettos. A third of the residents of the Eastern European ghettos died in the 2 or 3 years that they existed through exposure, disease, starvation. So however you feel about Gaza before October 7th, it really was not at all reminiscent of an Eastern European ghetto in New Order Europe, and so it's a faulty comparison, and a very mendacious and malicious one, I would say. Also, I mean, let's just say this: if Israel had a goal of committing genocide against Palestinians, how in the world would the Palestinian population have increased? Frankly, in geometric terms, since the onset of the occupation and even since 2000. Now, if we address the issue of this war, because people were accusing Israel of genocide before, and the people who accuse Israel of genocide now are saying that Gaza was a prelude, and I think that's false. 40,000 people have been killed approximately in Gaza. We don't know the ratio of combatants to civilians in 9 months. But just bear in mind that the Nazis destroyed all of about 2/3 of Polish Jewry, 2 million people in that same time span, that it took them a summer with Auschwitz turning at full capacity to eliminate 400,000 Hungarian Jews. It's ridiculous. I mean, no, numbers don't tell us everything, but at a certain point, the discrepancy in numbers is so significant that the cases are just not comparable. And also, mass casualty events are not necessarily genocides, so many people have died in Gaza, but have they been targeted because they're part of an ethnic group or because it's an intractable war in which people cannot flee? I would say it's the latter, and many fewer. And even, by the way, let's compare Gaza to other genocides. It took about 3 months for 500,000 Tutsis to be murdered in 1994, and this was a society that was fairly primitive, in Rwanda, where people were being killed by their neighbors after being incited to do so by radio broadcast. It's just ridiculous. The comparison is absurd. The numbers don't support that.
Daniel, how many deals were the Auschwitz Jews offered in 1944 to end the gas chamber?
Exactly.
Did they reject 9 deals to shut down the gas chamber? I mean, to even ask the question is so absurd.
Right. right.
Uh,
And it's also, I mean, let's remember that, the Nazis hunted down Jews in every corner of Europe,
Right.
literally from the Channel Islands, Britain's Channel Islands, which were conquered as part of the fall of France, to Rhodes on the
Wow.
doorstep of Turkey. Um, Israel doesn't really care about Palestinians who are not, in the territory. Israel would like nothing more um, than to see Gaza emptied, I think, which you can call that what you want, but it's not genocide. It really, unlike the Nazis who saw the Jews as kind of a planetary enemy, an existential threat who had to be blotted out wherever they were, this is very localized. This is territorial. And also, it is in the context, as you know, of a war that the other side is initiating.
Yeah, for me, and tell me if you think this makes sense. To me, if these people really believed it was a genocide, when Hamas, I think Hamas has now rejected 9 ceasefire deals, or maybe more than that. They would, when that news comes out, they would be so angry. We would be
Yeah.
seeing them tweeting, "God damn it, Hamas, save the children! Why are you doing this?" I mean, could you imagine? And I'll just go back to this. 1944, the New York Times, the headline: Auschwitz Jews refuse deal to shut down the gas chambers. Could you imagine how angry American Jews would be? How furious they would be? What the
Yeah.
hell are you thinking? I mean, so the fact that you see none of that every time Hamas rejects a deal, and I'll raise that point, and people will say, well, the deal, it wasn't a permanent end to the war.
Okay.
And
Well,
I'll be like, but if it's a genocide,
it's a
you have to
ceasefire.
end it now. This is total eradication.
Also, do
You
they know how
have
a
to.
ceasefire works?
What?
There's no such thing as a permanent ceasefire.
Yeah, I
It's a
so
contradiction in terms.
who I
Uh, but the problem is that
who
we're just dealing with people who are liars, who act in bad faith. It's all calumny, it's all slander.
well who is a person you most respected? Because I'll say it. I can think of some people I do respect who have used the term. But could you think of who's the person you respect most that has been using the genocide term?
You know, there have been people who are fairly eminent, like Dirk Moses, who else? Adam Tooze. There have been some really great eminent historians who have, I think, really thrown caution to the wind. Uh, Omer Bartov, who's a scholar of the Holocaust, has not called it genocide, but walked up right to the line. And he even went into one of the encampments at the University of Pennsylvania to encourage the students there. I find that unconscionable. Um, to be honest with you, I find that to be an act of treason against the Jewish people
To what? To what?
to enter into alliance with the encampments, to deny what's so transparently obvious about that. They feature anti-Semitic insignias and rhetoric, and that while these encampments drew a really mixed multitude from people who were just upset by images on social media to those concerned about human rights. And like, it's legitimate to be concerned about Israel's conduct of the war and to ask questions about it and have a discussion. To people who are Arab Muslim supremacists. I mean, that's what I call that. And the Arab Muslim supremacists are driving the bus on the campus. A lot of, students from Arab Muslim countries who have imported the language of their regimes onto the American campus. I mean, it's really sobering when you receive pamphlets at Berkeley that call Israel a Zionist entity. And if it sounds like a translation from the Arabic or the Persian, it's because it is with these foreign students. There's been some great reporting on this in Tablet about how foreign students from the Muslim world have contributed to this problem.
With Iran and Israel, the analogy I always like to make is Imagine if Spain had some kind of coup or something in 1980. And ever since 1980, they're ruled by like a Catholic monarchy that said our state religion is wiping out Poland. And we're going to fund three militias to fire rockets on Poland, you know, and that we might nuke Poland and we're going to wipe the Polish entity off the map. If that happened, people would be like, "Are you insane? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, this country is totally insane." But if you're doing it to the Jewish country, then
Yeah.
it's totally cool. That's
I
fine.
mean, again, I think it's what's really alarming is that for those of us who've been on campus for a long time, as I have been, I was an undergraduate at Harvard from 2012 to 2016. Um, and now at Berkeley since 2021, like you've seen such a ratcheting up in the past decade. Like, yeah, Palestinian activists on campus thought Israel was malicious, you know, and the Summa Malum, the worst of all worsts, in 2012. They didn't dare use language like Zionist entity and, we don't want two states, we want all of 48. What's disturbing is the eliminationist rhetoric, language which is reminiscent of the ugliest regimes in the world, has become totally mainstreamed on the American left and become just kind of prosaic on the American campus. Um, I have to tell you, when I first saw the protests at Berkeley in the wake of October 7th that were anti-Israel, I was really like almost paralyzed by the fact that they had crossed those lines. Again, I'm like not that old. I'm 29, but there was something ridiculous. I mean, the term Zionist entity for me mostly was just sort of a ridiculous line until these events. You think of Ahmadinejad, but no, I mean, this is now a central feature of their discourse. You know, they, you know, listen, they can say all they want. They are just about human rights uh, and compassion, but it's not a coincidence that pro-terror rhetoric and symbols are at all their rallies, whether you're talking at the inverted triangle, that we saw on the banners they were hoisting in Berkeley, to the Houthi flags they also had their encampment, to what you see at Union Station this week. At a certain point, you don't really believe them when they tell you that these are minority elements in their movement. Clearly, maybe they are minority elements in their movement, but they're the hardcore. They're the ones driving the bus and setting the agenda and diffusing into the American body politic some really macabre accusations against Israel and the Jewish state. I'm not sure if you recall this. One, they were trying this out a few weeks ago, accusing Israel of training dogs to rape
Oh,
Palestinian women.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, who
It's
knew?
just
Like, who knew Jews are actually so devious that they defy, the kind of anatomical and cognitive limits of canines.
I mean, I honestly believe I could like create an account and call it like Gaza City News, and I could post something like breaking IDF developed new blood bomb, which operates using the blood of Palestinian infants to supercharge the attack. And people would fucking believe, millions of people
Yeah, they
would
would believe
just
it.
buy it. They would buy anything. Now, let me just say, for balance's sake, that I'm not reflexively, if anybody says anything bad about Israel, I don't believe it. That is not my position. For instance, I don't think apartheid state is the right term, but the accusation of apartheid, for instance, with the West Bank, I don't think that's something that can just be simply hand waved away, right?
I don't think so either.
Considering, yeah, considering like they're defined by elections they can't vote in. Yeah. So I just
I
want
think
to
that
make
I
it
think that
clear.
it's different from what
It's
you had in
different.
South Africa,
Yeah.
you know, in the sense that I mean it's always hard, right? When you have these terms that are developed in one political context and you have to apply them
Right.
to another. Because there's always this tension in comparison, right? An analogy. Is the analogy and or comparison illuminating the event at hand or obscuring important aspects of it?
Right.
You know, I tend to be really wary of analogies. Um, and I include the South, the question of apartheid in Israel Palestine in that. But I'd say this, Palestinians live without on the West Bank without civil rights, without freedom of movement, without access to elections, with limited access to land and resources. And there are communities right next to them which have all those rights.
Right.
I I don't think that the thing is, apartheid was a consciously constructed system, starting in the 1940s when the National Party took over in South Africa. And, it deliberately separated people who actually had been fairly mixed before. In a way, I think that Israel kind of stumbled or sleepwalked into what can kind of approximate apartheid in practice. But I don't think, you know, those who won the 6 Day War had that as their design.
Right.
Um, I think it's something that has developed gradually, has festered in the course of 5 decades, often kind of precipitated by security concerns and less by, you know, people claiming, in South Africa, the white minority had a fear of blacks that was largely like sexual in nature, that was kind of sanitary in nature. And that was part of the separation. That's not really why Israelis and Palestinians are separated. You know, the fear that Jewish society would disappear and merge with Palestinians, I think, is far fetched. No, I mean the reason these barriers have been erected is largely due to security concerns, um, which are not imaginary. At the same time, you know, um, I think it's legitimate if you're a West Bank Palestinian to be outraged
Yes.
that it takes you 3 hours to move from Ramallah to Hebron, and that your life is hemmed in by just the thicket of regulations and rules that you can barely understand at times.
Yeah, or just to have politicians like Smotrich having so much control over the administration of where you live, an
Right,
individual
right.
you don't like, you never got to vote for or against. Right. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge here
And
that
their
though
vision,
we
if you're looking at someone like Smotrich or Ben Gvir, their vision is either expulsion or apartheid.
oh, I was just talking about this with Nicholas Grossman. I read Smotrich's decisive plan. I was frankly shocked for how long it is. There's no detail. I mean, he
Oh,
says, like, he proposes this outrageous stuff about either they can give up their national aspirations or we'll send them to an Arab country, and they never list it. I mean, it's just, anyways. But I just wanted us to,
well,
well,
ultimately, you have to
yeah,
accept, you have to accept one premise here: Israelis aren't going away,
yeah.
and nor are Palestinians.
Right. Well, yeah, but it is scary. Of course, it's on both sides, but you do see rhetoric on the Israeli far right that is very alarming, to say the least. But
Yeah,
I just wanted us both, because we both argued against using the genocide term. I just want us both to acknowledge, of course, as you do, that there is terror, that the Gazans have suffered terribly. There's
Yeah.
been shocking videos, and we don't seek to deny that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
even, I'd say this, even some of the reporting that's come out of 972 is really disturbing. Um, you know, I shouldn't say this, but it's in politics for me to say this, but it's not out of the question that Israel's committed war crimes.
Oh,
It
yes.
it may have, it probably has, based on the reporting that we've had out of places like 972
The
about
AI stuff.
well, about AI targeting, about even stealing people's property, when they go into individual homes in some cases. And also, let's be very clear. What some of these soldiers have done on their social media accounts is disgraceful.
100%.
Parading in someone's undies, or boasting about dynamiting an apartment building. It's cruel. I mean, maybe that's not a war crime, but it's cruel, and it's not something
Yeah.
that
Yep.
we as a people want on our conscience.
Right.
It does not rise to our standards of morality, and we have to be able to speak honestly about how this war has deformed the conscience and morals of some in our community. Yeah.
Very well said. I want to get your assessment of something. So, this is from a podcast called Left Reckoning. The host is named Matt Leck. Now, but I want to give background. I've never heard Matt Leck. He's like a communist, anti-Zionist. None of these people are Jewish or Arab or Muslim, by the way. But they all hate Israel. I've never heard him say anything anti-Semitic. But I'm gonna play this, and I want you to help me how to characterize people with this level of obsessive hatred of Israel.
Yeah, we are. I think fascism is a real word to worry about in this country. I think maybe we could just start using Zionism, maybe as a better proxy for the people who subscribe to like a extreme crackdown of American freedom and colonial projects like that. But like, I don't know. Like, I'm rambling a little bit, so I'll let one of you guys jump in.
No, I mean, I think
Now, I mean, what do
I mean,
you? How do you? Yeah, you go ahead.
it's just classic scapegoating. I mean, it's wow, they're so creative. Do you know that they've managed to distill all their political grievances and all their, personal issues, and all their social reservations into one word, Zionism, which is the fault of it all. That's so creative of them historically, right? I mean, you know, using Jews and Judaism, and in this case Zionism, as a byword for what ails the world, is of great historical vintage and not particularly creative, and
But
frankly
he
not
works
particularly
with a Jew. He works with a Jew.
great. I mean, and not particularly interesting, if you ask me. And it is true that we've seen this kind of anti-Semitism surface. Palestine manages to encapsulate all the problems. Um, Palestine, because Israel's destroying the environment in Palestine. So it's also about climate change. Greta Thunberg said some of this too, I think. It's absurd. But the problem is that, and this is the rub, absurdity can be lethal. Absurdity can be murderous. It was the great historian George Mossy, the great historian of the Third Reich and of Germany, himself, a German Jew who escaped before the Holocaust, who observed that idiocy has often a determinative role in history. Often intellectuals fail to grasp that. crackpots and coup can influence decisively the course of events. Uh, and they diffuse their semi-intellectual propaganda far and wide. That was true of the German far right in the early 20th century, and that's true of this American far left, in the early 21st century. It's stupid. We also have to take it very seriously.
Yeah, one thing I disagree with Jewish organizations was there was this big focus on from the river to the sea, but less focus on what I find much more just I think there should just be zero tolerance for, which is this no Zionists on campus, or they're a Zionist and let's surround them, or or this is the new one, AZB, all Zionists are bastards.
Oh, it's like ACAB.
Yeah, like ACAB, because, and I had this argument with this account called the Antifa Turtle, who likes to say they're anti-Nazi, and then the next post they'll be doing this. All Zionists are bastards. So 90% of Jews are bastards.
Don't you love this
90
sublime historical inversion in which the heirs of the Nazis are the Jews? I mean, it's not enough, maybe you don't believe in God, but it's enough to make you believe that Satan is real.
Right.
No, it really is just disgusting. And it's said to offend us. It's said to Jew bait. It's said to get a rise out of us. These people know what they're doing. Again, it's no coincidence that they never compare, Zionists to the Hutus. It's only the Nazis. To some extent, that points to their lack of kind of moral or historical reference points. Right. But it's also done to wound and to hurt and to offend. In terms of no Zionists on campus, there are several problems there. One is that the American campus should be pluralistic, and that no group should be categorically excluded from speech there. And that's what's also so rich about a lot of these activists who, very selectively and hypocritically invoke free speech. But they think they're the only ones with the right to speak. They're fundamentally anti-liberal and anti-pluralist. Listen, at Berkeley, they fomented a mob in February to shut down an Israeli speaker. People had to be evacuated. They broke windows. They choked someone, and also their encampments are not within the bounds of free speech in the sense that they wind up expropriating whole swaths of public space and turning them into spaces where only one opinion is allowed. I believe in pluralism. I believe in debate, and these people do not. And the other thing is, we can say this until we're blue in the face. Like, Zionist is like the only, epithet that is said with such venom. Like, you can be, the disciples of sheep. It's absurd, right? Here in France, the French left, the extreme French left, was saying that there should be, quote, mobilization against Israeli participation in the Olympics. Well, A, that's highly irresponsible 50 years after Munich. But B, we literally have delegations from North Korea at the Games. North Korea, a country that has prison camps that hold about 5 to 10% of its population. So, yeah.
DSA, I don't know if you saw this, they just endorsed AOC. Did you hear about that?
No, that's hilarious.
Okay, do you want to know why they did that?
She's a Zionist.
They did that because she appeared on a Zoom call with Amy Spitalnik, who is
the Jewish public affairs, whatever, right?
A lawyer who did this great trial against the Charlottesville Nazis with Robbie Kaplan called Science v.
She's She's like Jewish public affairs. I think that she's involved with like JCRC.
Yeah, she's a Democrat. She did a Zoom with
So
AOC
ridiculous.
talking about anti-Semitism, Israel. They said, you appeared on a Zoom with a Zionist.
Wow.
You're done. You're out. I mean, what is so amazing is like, what happened to fighting for universal health care? Do you remember that, DSA? Because, Daniel, I'm probably quite a bit more left-wing than you. You know, I want universal health care. I want much higher taxes on rich people, you know, but they have no energy for that. But they have so
They've
much
been
energy.
consumed with this kind of monomania. It's a monomania. It's sick, you know? But, you know, one of my mentors in the history department at Berkeley said, you know, Danny, what you need to remember about anti-Semitism, what's so insidious about it is that it doesn't only harm Jews, it harms non-Jews. And I think that's an example of this, you know, a social movement that basically hobbles itself with this fixation. Arab Muslim societies that have been stagnant and anemic for the past few decades, in large measure because they use their hatred of Israel as a means of avoiding introspection and self-criticism. Anti-Semitism is a powerful drug, you know. It's it's anti-Semitism, the needle and the damage done, you know.
You're telling me that Iran has not brought prosperity and peace to Lebanon and Yemen? Is that what?
Yeah, can you believe it?
Wow.
It's
You're
true.
saying
I mean, like,
Microsoft is not building their new microchip factory in South Lebanon? Really?
but
Wow.
you know, it's pedestrian, but it also in ways it's also profound. I mean, if you look at societies that enshrine anti-Semitism as central organizing principles of their politics, it's usually to their detriment.
I think there are these efficient questions, I'll call them that. Like one question that can easily sort different groups politically into subgroups. For Democrats, the one to suss out who's really hates Israel is like really fringe on foreign policy. All you need to ask is, who do you like more, Saudi Arabia or Iran? And all of the people that say Iran, they also like Hezbollah. They also like Hamas. They want to wipe out the Zionist entity.
It's an interesting question because the answer can almost have shifted. You know, it might not have been so unreasonable in 2002 to say Iran.
Right.
But you know, today we should really be encouraging the Gulf monarchies are embarked on an absolutely praiseworthy and ambitious process of social transformation. In it, they've understood, most particularly the UAE, that they need to discard some of these old idols, which have held them back, and that they need to really embrace some of the values of the open society, maybe not democratic politics, in order to really be competitive in this century. I think the UAE is just incredibly encouraging. You know, Saudi Arabia is also going down that path, whereas the mullahs just keep digging in.
Yeah, but I also want to say I'm not suggesting that, hey, you know, Muslim Middle East, just forget the Palestinians. Focus on, you know, building new water slides in, you know, Riyadh or what. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it's better than going down the path of we're going to wipe out the Zionist entity. I do think.
I mean, it's one thing to be concerned about Palestinian rights as a regime, and to have that in the ambit of concerns, you know, that you raise in international institutions, and you know, have every, you know, like in Iraq, you know, is Palestine Square, and you know, nationwide celebrations for suicide bombers under Saddam Hussein. That's pathological.
I'm curious, if you were Israeli, what party would you vote for?
Labor Meretz.
I think me too, bro. Me too. Yeah.
Because now they've fused for the next elections, whenever they are. I think that, listen, we need Israel. Israel's also really vulnerable. The actions of the current prime minister, let's be honest, if you're an anti-Semite, the first order of blame rests with you for being anti-Semitic.
Right.
But has Bibi shown callous disregard for the situation that he's put the diaspora in? Absolutely. Right. Have they engaged in conduct which imperils the lives of Jews in France and America? Yes. And they've done so cavalierly. And ultimately...
Example? Can you give an example?
Well, I don't think they've considered at all that their rhetoric, Netanyahu's rhetoric on Amalek, even Herzog, there are no innocent people there. Smotrich, certainly, when he talks about forcing Palestinians out and Ben Gvir with his colony. I mean, Smotrich said a few days after I published my piece on the genocide question that he wanted Gaza to be like the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, these people make it very easy for diaspora Jews who defend Israel to be stigmatized. And they also don't consider at all, in their conduct of the war and their choice to drag it on, that every day it goes on, French and American Jewish life become harder.
Right.
They just do.
It seems like we're pretty much on the same ground on this. Because I spend a lot of time monitoring Israeli English language media. And I tried from...
Yeah, like Ynet, Time for Israel.
I listen to, I listen to get... I listen to Caroline Glick. I was left-wing, right-wing. I listen to get to see what the far right in Israel is thinking.
Caroline Glick is a kook.
Well, I might try to get her on the show, so I'm not gonna say anything. But to get an insight into what the real sort of far right in Israel is thinking, I listened to this podcast that Jonathan Pollard, Jonathan Pollard, and this rabbi do, and it's very funny.
The amazing thing about Jonathan Pollard was Jonathan Pollard attacking the hostage families.
Oh my!
For undermining Israel's geopolitical interests,
accusing other people of treason.
Do you need a fucking mirror? Like,
oh my God, I gotta send you, but
and also, I mean, it's just so funny how he has rewritten his own story. He was spying on America for the Israeli common interest. No, he was doing it to fund his drug habit.
Oh, really? What drug?
Yeah.
Coke?
He was getting handed bags of cash and he was flying high on cocaine.
Oh my God. I think
for someone like that to attempt to hector the families of hostages, it's just obscene.
Can I tell you a funny Pollard story?
Sure.
I think look, I'm not going to say it's a lie, but I think he makes up a lot of these stories, but he claims he's been telling these prison stories, and he claims that his entire time in prison, everybody thought he was a Muslim because he didn't wear a kippah. He wore this like a kufi or something, like that different kind of. And so he claims that Muslim prisoners would come up to him to ask him about hadith, and he would just tell them, he said, straight Talmud. but he also has this story where the head of the Aryan nations like confronted him in jail, and his roommates were like, "Oh, bring a knife," and he didn't. And he went out there, and it's super dramatic. And the guy's like, why? And it's I think it's all made up because it sounds like a movie, and it's like the Nazi leader's underling said the Jew didn't even bring a knife. He must be a coward. And then Jonathan Pollard just said, "I'm not afraid of you. I'm only afraid." And he looks up to the sky and he says, "I'm only afraid of Hashem." And
What
then
is this, like the Shawshank Redemption?
yeah. And then the Nazi leader said something like, "I can respect that."
Yeah, I mean, he's a bullshit artist.
There was a Nazi general that showed up on the compound, a white supremacist, a general, a brutal murderer. And he asked to see me outside my dorm. And he had 20 or 30 people with him, each one a murderer. And I said, okay. And my friends were trying to persuade me not to go outside because they were afraid I wouldn't be coming back in. But something told me, no, go. So I took the knife out of my pocket and put it down and walked outside. And of course, one of his guards patted me down to see if I were armed. And he laughed and he looked at this Nazi general with a big swastika on his forehead and said, "The Jew isn't even armed. He's a real coward." And I started laughing. And I said, "No, I'm not a coward. I just am not afraid of you, that's all." And so the general looked at me and said, "I've got 30 or 40 men with me now and hundreds in this prison. Who do you have?" And I looked straight up with my finger. And I said, "I have the biggest general of them all with the largest army you could ever imagine." So he looked at me and he said, "So," and I said, "So I fear no one but God." And I don't know where it came from. It just came out of my mouth. So he extended his hand, a bloody hand, and I shook it, and I had no problem from him or his men for the next 20 years.
But anyways, I listen to Moshe Feiglin when he gives English language interviews.
He was like
One
in
of
the what was it, like the Jewish
Zahu.
power contingent or whatever.
That's Ben Gvir's party.
No, he was in this factional food. Was it called Jewish Leadership? I forget. It
I
used
think
to be like the
he was in
further end.
Likud. Yeah.
Yeah, but he was on the
Yeah.
right end of Likud.
Yeah. Well, but they say things that it really bothers me. The Israeli far right, they just speak. It's like they're delusional. It's like they're totally delusional.
Well, that's the problem. They
yeah.
speak in a way that they don't understand the whole world is listening, and they are really destructive to Jewish interests.
Yeah.
Really destructive. And they should excuse me for being vulgar. Shut the fuck up.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I don't want to keep you forever, so you've been so generous with your time. So why don't we just end on France, since you are in France? There was a election a few weeks ago. A lot of people were worried that Le Pen's party, the National Rally, was going to win it. They didn't. There was a Popular Front alliance between Macron's party and the far left party, I think, Mélenchon. It's very complicated. Now, here's what I'm confused by. And I thought I heard this. So didn't Macron, wasn't his gambit to get Le Pen's party to actually win so that they would have to do the dirty work of governing for like 2 years before the presidential election, and that it would like decrease their chances in that? Or am I mistaken?
I think that it's hard to read him. I mean, like, listen, he is such a sphinx that members of parliament in his own party still find this position to be utterly baffling. So, to some extent, it's all speculation. But I think that there were two scenarios maybe that he envisioned. One was a scenario in which, in France, there's been this tendency where people will vote for extremes in elections that don't matter that much, or in the first round of elections, and then they come to their senses in the second round, or in the election that matters. So they have their hissy fit, the French and the European elections, but they're not real elections. They're for the European Parliament, which is basically this kind of talk shop, right? So I'm going to call the voters to the polls for our parliament. They'll take it more seriously, and I'll remind them, what's what. So there's some who believe that he actually expected his party to be able to win. That was maybe one scenario. The other is, as you described, which is that maybe the calculation might have been, to force the RN from the opposition into the government and basically, obligate it to actually run the country in a limited way, because it wouldn't be controlling the presidency, but only the premiership and the cabinet, and basically demonstrate to the country that these people are not fit, to hold the reins of power. Obviously, that's pretty risky. In the end, the voters, dashed all those plans to bits. The problem is they gave no one a governing majority. The voters said they didn't want the RN to be in power because ultimately they, in many cases coalesced around the anti-RN candidate. But the anti-RN forces in the country cannot really agree on much of anything except that they don't want the RN in power. That makes it very hard to govern. France will have to pass a budget in September. Not clear how that's going to happen.
Yeah. What is going on? So have they picked? What have they sorted out? Who's going to be leading the thing? Sorry.
So just to explain, France has a pretty unique system. It has what we call a semi-presidential system. So the presidency, held by Emmanuel Macron, is a very strong executive, with emergency decree powers in the Constitution, which has complete control over foreign policy in the military, and which in some cases, the government, the cabinet, basically the prime minister and his counselors can pass legislation without the parliament. So this is a system, the Fifth Republic, as we call it, which concentrates a lot of power in the hands of the presidency and in the government, headed by the prime minister. The prime minister is appointed by the president and generally serves at his pleasure. And the way that the French election calendar is set up, it's almost always that the prime minister and the president are from the same party, because the prime minister has to be able to assemble a majority vote in the parliament. But because parliamentary elections in France occur generally right after presidential elections, the parliament and the presidency are in the same hands, essentially. We are in a peculiar situation in which that's no longer the case. So, question is, who will be prime minister? The left has its candidate, which it's proposed. And it's true the left has the greatest number of seats, but it only has 190 seats. And Macron's party has 165. And the RN has 145. And so no one really can govern independently. What Macron seems to want to do right now, France has a caretaker government. So the same team from before the elections is in place. but they do not have the same powers, you know, as they did as a government of, as we would call, plein exercice. You know, it's limited what they can do right now. Anyway, um, Macron will eventually have to appoint a prime minister because that's the only way that you can start to pass legislation. And it seems that what he might do is, remember, there are about 589 seats in the French parliament. So you need to get, 577 seats. You need 289 votes for a majority. He has 165. So what it seems like what they might do is they might rely on the votes of the moderate right, which gets them to about 210 seats collectively, Macron and the moderate right, and then rely on the far right to abstain from voting to essentially pass legislation. You kind of understand?
So this is a fight over who's going to be the prime minister?
Who's going to be the prime minister, and
Okay.
then ultimately what kind of legislation might be pushed. Because the left has its own legislative program, which it outlined in the run-up to the elections. It's very radical, actually, in my opinion. It includes the recognition of the state of Palestine. It includes the creation of a new status of climate refugee, probably would result in a huge wave of migration.
You see, that's why I think that everybody was saying that Le Pen lost. I think she might have won by losing.
Well, in some ways she's won by losing, yeah, because no one can really run the country. And what does the far right really thrive on? Chaos and gridlock.
I just imagine what that climate refugee, if that was implemented, I mean, that would do wonders for the.
It won't be implemented. It's not going to happen. But I mean, listen, at this point, because of the politics of migration, because of 10 years of terror attacks, people maybe in the American audience don't remember this. In 2015, you had, France's main soccer stadium, cafes in the center of the city, and a concert hall attacked. That was in November 2015. And then earlier that same year, you had the kosher grocery store attacked and Charlie Hebdo. In 2017, you had people mowed down on one of the most popular beaches in the country in Nice. In 2016, you had a priest who had his throat slit in the middle of giving mass by an Islamic radical. 3 years ago, Samuel Paty, the teacher who showed the Muhammad cartoons, was decapitated by a parent in the Paris suburbs. This has really, really, really upset political dynamics in France. There is a growing sense of insecurity due to Islamic radicalism, and also, frankly, due to the fact that immigrants committed a disproportionate number of crimes in French society, based on the statistics that we have. And so France has been moving rightward. If you look at any poll on this, it's the case. And if you look at the percentages in the elections, it's the right that keeps gaining vote share. Le Pen's party got 37% of the vote in the second round, 33% of the vote in the first round in these legislative elections. If you combine all the forces of the right in France, they have about 45% of the population. The center, embodied by Macron, has about 20%. And I would say that in many ways, Macron is center-right. He's closer to the right than he is to the left. And the left, on a good day, can get 30% of the vote.
Just a small question. Because I get confused, I don't speak French. Is LFI France in some... I can't say. So what that means, like
Insoumise.
France unbound or
It's like
unbowed?
rebellious France,
Okay.
like,
That's Mélenchon. Okay.
yeah,
So the LFI is the Mélenchon party, right?
yeah.
Okay. I follow a bunch of French Jews on Twitter, and there's one account in particular. I bet you know it. It's a French name, but really does not like the LFI and says it's.
Well, I mean, very few French Jews like LFE.
So why is that?
Because, I mean, you should maybe, do you have a subscription to Haaretz?
I don't, but I should.
If you can, I mean, I can send it to you if you remind me. I kind of outlined this in some of the articles I wrote in the run up to the election. But I mean, the brief explanation is that LFE is courting a new Arab Muslim electorate in the Paris suburbs and in like working class areas that honestly is like vociferously anti-Israel and often anti-Semitic. And the party leader says things which are in that key, the party the party's leader and his deputies have made statements which are anti-Semitic. For example,
he said that sorry, go ahead.
Mélenchon, when Jeremy Corbyn lost, he said, "I'm not going to be like Jeremy Corbyn. I won't let the arrogant bullies of Crif, force my hand and control me." Crif is the central body of French Jews.
Oh wow!
So it's like pretty explicit, That's about as explicit as you can get.
So just let me understand. So is LFI, what is their stance on gay rights?
Pro.
Okay. So how do they manage that? How do they balance the two?
Well, I mean, how does the American? I mean, this is kind of a thing, right? I mean, right now in the coalition politics,
right,
the Islamists and the leftists can be in the same party. I'm not sure if they'll always be able to, but that's been a calculation of the far left in France and other European countries. They can increase their vote share by appealing to Islamists and immigrants, and I mean, yeah, go on.
So what's happened to the what's it called? La Republicans? The Republicans? Are they like really diminished?
So let's say there were three blocks, right? We have the left, and the left is basically LFE, which we talked about. It's the Greens, which we call Les Verts, the Socialists, who used to be the party of government. The Socialists elected Mitterrand and Hollande, and then the French Communist Party, which used to be very prominent in the country's politics, but is less so. That's the left. The center now is Macron's party and a few allied parties. Then you have the right. The right historically was led by what is now called Les Républicains. And that was the party of de Gaulle long ago. And yes, it's much diminished because the far right has stolen much of its vote. So I think that LR, which is now split, because a part of LR went to the RN and a part resisted that. LR gained about 7% of the vote in the last elections in the first round. Compare that to 32% for the RN. But the thing is, despite their small numbers, they hold a crucial number of seats where at times they can be the kingmakers. So that's what Macron's trying to do, use them to have enough votes. Because he says, me and LR, we're 220 votes, and the left has 190 votes. So we have a larger block than they do. And if the RN, the far right, sits out the vote, then we can win. And that's what happened actually when they were electing the president of the National Assembly, which is the lower house of parliament. The RN sat out the vote, basically, and the center and the right were able to elect their candidate against the left. So a lot of people think that's Macron's game now.
So, and Zemmour, who's very interesting. He's a French Jew who's the leader of like Le Pen's cousin or whatever, Marine or whatever. She has left.
Marielle Maréchal.
Yeah, she has left her family's sort of party, the National Rally. I heard to go to Zemmour. So Zemmour.
But now Zemmour actually he's done for now because Marielle Maréchal ditched him, and she went back to the National Rally during the legislative elections.
So what is Zemmour's party?
It is called Reconquête, Reconquest.
Reconquest. Okay.
Like Reconquista.
So I interviewed, it's going to be coming out soon, Luc Bernard, who's French. I don't know if you know him. He's a video game designer. He lives in LA now. And I said, well,
I've seen his stuff.
Yeah, I was like, is Marine Le Pen, is she anti-Semitic? And he was basically like, not really. She's not like her father. What do you think?
I mean, I would say that I don't know her mind or her heart. I think that she hasn't made any anti-Semitic statements, which is already huge progress. I think it's really positive that in order to be a respectable force in French politics, you can't be openly anti-Semitic.
Right.
And she has tried, for reasons cynical and or, sincere, to purge those elements of the party. She hasn't done enough because in the course of these elections, there came out, that there are all these candidates with these very checkered histories. They didn't vet their candidates. They should have. But I don't think, I still wouldn't vote for the far right, though I know that a lot of French Jews are tempted to, because they see the far right as a potential protector against the far left and, more migration. I wouldn't vote for the far right because, in France, the far right, just like in the rest of Europe, threatens certain fundamental institutions. They want to weaken checks on their own power that exist in the form of bodies like the Conseil d'État and the Conseil Constitutionnel that review legislation passed by Parliament. These bodies sort of operate as a kind of Supreme Court. They want to privatize public television and radio, which might just be a kind of stalking horse for selling off those properties to their friends and having loyal, controlled media. It's not really clear to me it's not clear to me that Le Pen and her team in power would not try to do in France what we saw Law and Justice do in Poland and what we've seen Fidesz do in Hungary.
It seems like the French elections, it's like a repeat every time. It's always Le Pen, and then you get all these sensationalist stories. Oh, Le Pen, she could really do it this time. And then the first round they do well, and then the second round they don't win.
I guess it might seem like Groundhog Day.
Is she running again in the next?
Yeah, she'll run again in 2027. But you know what? Okay, yes, that's true. But you have to also just look at the statistics. In 2002, her father won 18% of the vote. In 2012, she didn't qualify for the second round. She came in third. In 2017, she got into the second round, and she won 33% of the vote. Then in 2022, she got into the second round again and won 41% of the vote. The National Assembly, in the Parliament, the RN has gone from having like 5 seats to having 145. So yeah, to some extent you could say it's like the boy who cried wolf. But the thing is, they are
gaining.
And like the polls that we have show that if there was an election today between Macron and Le Pen, she would win. Of course, Macron can't run again. His term,
Well, what is he going to
but
do with the rest of his life? He's so young.
yeah, I wonder that too.
Yeah, it's
I've
like
asked him.
Obama but younger.
It's like, yeah, what do you do after that? I mean, he'll be out of office. When he's out of office, he'll be 50. You know,
NATO, maybe we'll
you've
make
got
him
like,
the head of NATO or something. No, not really.
yeah, he might have European ambitions. I could see
Right.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you know, but the point is, I mean, I do think the far right can win the next elections. We'll have to see.
And so it won't. And what do you make of Bardella?
I mean, I just think that he's an empty suit. He's very slick and sleek, and I don't know. He's a sensation among the young. They all want to take a selfie with him. I mean, listen, I think that he speaks very fluidly. I don't think he's like the brightest, but I think he's a good salesman.
It's really strange in when I look at France. Like there's a.
Also, it's ridiculous. I mean, sorry, having a 28-year-old prime minister is absurd.
I mean, but it is so striking. There's another guy you might know named Boyland or something, and I think he's but he's like looks like he's 19 years old. Do you know who I'm talking about? Blonde
No,
hair.
but I mean, I will say to you that that's one of the things about the French political class is that, you know, the French political class, think about it this way. France is a country with 350 senators. That's the upper chamber of the French parliament. And that's mostly like the House of Lords. It has an advisory role, mostly. 577 deputies, as we call them, members of the lower house of parliament, the National Assembly. And, you know, every department, and there are 101 departments, has its own little legislature or council in every region. There are about, 14 regions? So I'd say this, if you want to live, if you want to, in some ways, if you're a young person, it's much easier to kind of climb the ladder because there are a lot more posts, Like in America, we have 435 seats for 330 million people in the House. In France, they have 577 for 66 million.
Yeah, his name is Louis Boyard. Do you know that guy?
Oh yeah, ew.
He looks like a 16-year-old.
He's on the far left. He's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the point is, like, you couldn't really have that in the House because, I mean, each House member represents like 1 million people almost at this point. You just have to have more money. You have to have more time to get to a place where you can be elected to the House.
But who's going to be replacing Macron, do you think, versus Le Pen?
Man, I wish I knew. I think that the left will have a problem because Mélenchon will want to run again. But the problem is that he can get 20% of the vote, but no more, which means they won't get into the second round. So the question is, will the left be able to have a united candidacy? Probably not. The moderate right, maybe they'll try to field a candidate, whatever. I personally think that it'll be another second round, which will come down to Le Pen and someone from the Macronist camp, maybe someone who's a little more popular in that camp. Whether it's the current prime minister, Gabriel Attal, or the former prime minister, Edouard Philippe, they're looking very strong as potential candidates in the Macronist fold. That will be really the test of Macronism, right? Whether it can survive Macron, whether the centrist party, because it could also splinter and fall apart. We'll have to see, because there are tensions in the Macronist coalition too between its left-wing and right-wing elements. So one of the things that we'll be watching to see is if the center holds.
So I want to end with two broad Europe questions. One, looking at the European right, the big boon for them was the migrant crisis, right, of 2015 or that period when it was really making global news. And Steve Bannon, they had real high hopes. This was going to be a continent-wide revolution, et cetera, et cetera. We're in 2024 now, so we're about 10 years since the height of that. I mean, I sort of think Maloney is sort of an emblematic figure. Took power, but really has not pleased that element of the Italian right. So what's your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I'd say this. What did Max Weber say about politics? He said, politics is the slow boring of hard boards.
Right.
It takes time. And you have to have patience, whether you're on the right or left, to realize your project. I would say that, we are seeing the far right accomplish a long march through the institutions into power in France. That's probably what's happening, if I had to guess. And also maybe the height of the migrant crisis is over, but remember that it's not only these peaks, it's also cumulative. You have a migration every year. And, every year society becomes a little more diverse. And you see that more on the street and in public life. And so, yeah, I mean, there are these kind of episodic shocks like 2015, but then there's also the kind of rising discontent associated with
Yeah. The issue is not, I'm not
to.
suggesting the issue is gone at all. Yeah.
And, I think that it's reasonable for European, French in this case, to say, for 50 years in the polls, 70 to 80% of us have said we want less migration. We keep getting more. And places that felt like they were familiar, we feel like we're strangers in. Places we grew up in, they feel very culturally alien, And I think that democratic electorates, people have a right to choose to some extent how their society is structured and to opt for cultural continuity. I don't think it's a violation of human rights for a country to have a restrictive immigration policy. One of the problems of the left is that it has tried to circumscribe popular sovereignty in the name of human rights. So, you can't limit migration because, like, climate refugees or all economic migrants are really refugees.
Well, it's sort of about rhetoric. Like, I think there is definitely danger in otherizing people, right? But if say, a politician who's completely respectful of all groups says, I want the number of immigrants to be 400,000 this year rather than 600,000. Obviously, that itself is not like some Hitler-right danger. The danger, though, is if that politician is running using, sort of dangerous tropes and rhetoric about groups, and I do respect that danger. I think,
yeah. I mean, it's a balance. There is a way of saying that our society has particular features that we want to preserve, and to some extent, those features are linked to demography.
Right. I'm just saying. I'm just saying, like, theoretically, if a politician was like calling Muslims like the enemy within, that we must purge. That
again.
yeah.
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the language that I would use is simply, culture and tradition are very thick. It's hard, if you really want to assimilate people, you can't have too many of them, and if you really want to integrate people into your society, you have to control the numbers.
Right.
That's really what I would say. And I would say that people also have a right. People also have a right to decide to do that in a democratic polity. To some extent, you have a right in a democratic polity to say, we're attached to this kind of aesthetic or cultural form, and we want to preserve it. And that influences migration policy ultimately.
Right.
But the question is, how do you do that? How do you have that rhetoric without lapsing into bigotry.
Right.
That depends on the responsibility of politicians.
Why are people from sort of the right in Italy so unhappy with Meloni?
I think it's because she hasn't, moved as aggressively against Europe. And also she hasn't stopped the boat.
Really?
The question is, I don't know about Meloni. Is she playing the long game though? It's true that she has been reforming the system in Italy to make it easier for populist parties to win elections through, reform of certain election procedures, and she has influenced the direction of public television and radio too in Italy. The question is, what's her game? Is she content to just kind of normalize herself and become like the moderate right? Is she going to become pragmatic on migration and say, you need workers? Or ultimately, is she biding her time?
Right.
I mean, we have evidence for both hypotheses.
From a Europe perspective, would you advise Israelis that there's sort of in a 15 to 20, or maybe not even that long, year window of a certain warmness of relations? Because it sort of seems like, to me, this is one of the reasons I think they should get rid of Netanyahu, and they just need to change the face of Israel to the world. But if Israel keeps going in this general direction, it seems like only a matter of time before the UK, France, recognize a state of Palestine. Do you sort of think that Israel is in this window of relations with Europe, and they're going to get a lot worse in like 15 years?
It's possible. Both because of, the question is, there's a demographic question, as you have
right
that kind of disadvantageous demography in the form of a growing Arab Muslim population. But then again, that can also play in both directions, because as we've seen, in some ways, European publics have become more pro-Israel in the past 20 years in the polls. And some of that really has to do with the reaction against Muslim migration. So nothing is really as clear as it seems.
Right.
But I would say yes. It's certainly certain European countries have been thoroughly alienated by the right in Israel. Look at Spain. Look at Norway. Both of which recognize Palestine recently. 15 and there were some murmurs about suspending EU association agreements with Israel because of the Gaza conflict. Ultimately, Israel's relations with the EU can't really be worsened in a way, because voiding the treaties between Israel and the EU or revising them would rely on unanimous consent.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the Hungarians are just never going to agree to that. The Czechs are never going to agree to that. You're always going to have those fiercely pro-Israel countries in the EU fold. They're going to obstruct that. France would not agree to that today. But who knows, 15 years from now, who knows? Maybe it would try to use the free trade deal to bring pressure. But I think it would be very hard to operate on the EU level in that way. But the question is, will individual countries and their foreign policies drive a tougher line? Right. I would say the Eastern Bloc, no, because of, the rightward tendencies there and the absence of Muslim migration. But, if you combine rising Arab Muslim vote share in Western Europe and you assume the far right doesn't come to power, but you have like kind of Macron, Merkel sorts, you could see a hardening of Israel policy.
Okay, there's a emerging view of Europe that, I listen to tech podcasts like the All In podcast, which is sort of these tech bros, David Sachs, the friends of Elon Musk. They do this podcast called All In. And whenever they bring up Europe, it's always, they always basically just laugh at Europe. Like their biggest tech company is Spotify. Their only role besides Spotify in the tech world is they pass regulations. And there is this emerging view of Europe as, China, US, we're the big dogs. Europe is just has a future of being a nice vacation home, living museum piece.
Yeah, the kind of nursing home museum paradigm.
Yeah. What is your view sort of on this?
I think that might be true economically. If you look at innovation and economic growth, Europe is stagnant. But I also think that's kind of ignorant, right? I mean, in the sense that I'm a historian. If you drop me in a French city of 10,000 people, I'm going to ultimately find it much more interesting to walk around than Charleston, West Virginia. It's like they want to reduce Europe's value to basically like the cash nexus. And this is a civilization with its art, with its literature, with its music, with its architecture. And, I refuse to demean it. Maybe in a way, I also embrace the kind of museum vision of Europe in that sense. But, I think that they are kind of Philistines, right? I mean, they undervalue, Germany has the best opera in the world. It has the most generous funding for music. France too, to a certain extent. You have so many people involved in the cultural sphere who are doing live shows with the support of the state. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's like I'm not going to scoff at Europe because it's economically anemic. It is culturally vital. And I think that they're kind of reductive. It's like, I mean, these are the same people who basically think that if you're rich, if you're poor, you don't have any value.
Right.
I would just disagree with that, if that makes sense.
Right. Obviously, you're extremely well read. Can you recommend some books?
So if you want to understand, I would say that, I'll give you a book for French Jewish history. One of the more formative texts in French Jewish history is called Vichy France and the Jews by Robert Paxton and Michael Morris. And it is a path-breaking piece of research that came out in the 70s. And it basically exposed the Vichy regime's complicity with the Third Reich in the deportation of a quarter of French Jewry. And, it is a great work of history and I think a foundational text in French Jewish studies. If you want to know more about French Jewry, I would also recommend reading Esther Ben-Bassa's History of the French Jews, which is available in English language translation. And then there is a great bilingual review magazine, which is called K period, the letter. And it is the preeminent magazine of ideas and art, I would say, in the French Jewish community. So if you want to learn more about French Jewry, I would say this is a good place to start. Also, if you're curious, I think that the Museum of Jewish Art and Culture in Paris has a lot of online resources as well for that. In terms of French politics, I would recommend reading Arthur Goldhammer's blog on Tocqueville 21. Very good, astute view of French politics. Goldhammer is a formidable translator. I mean, he translated, for example, Thomas Piketty from French into English, and he's a very astute observer of the scene. And the other good source for France stuff, if you're limited to English, is watch France 24 in
I
English.
do. The debate, Francois Picard.
So they will also France 24 also, when things are, for example, if there's a presidential debate, they will subtitle it in English. So it's probably the best place to start if you don't have French, in terms of just accessing that news.
Yeah. So, Daniel Solomon, what are you working on? And tell the audience where they can check out your work.
Yeah, I mean, I write for Haaretz semi-regularly. I've written for K. I used to be their English language translator, actually. I actually write semi-regularly for the American Conservative, because a good college friend of mine is the editor there. Recently, I actually published a profile of our new, here in France, I live in the countryside a lot of the time. And in our district, we elected a far-right member of parliament. And I spent an afternoon with her, and I wrote a profile of her in the American Conservative. So that's something that I've done recently. For the rest of the summer, I'll be working on my dissertation, which is on André Speer, a early French Zionist and poet. So that's what I'm up to.
Well, Daniel, it was really a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate it.